both of these stories feature not just the voices of women, not just the stories of women, but the voices of women, which is very unusual in the Torah. It's very unusual to have narratives driven by women, and then specifically kol isha, like the voice of women, which in many traditional contexts is now considered something, that is distracting and that is not meant to be mixed with prayer. Davka today, specifically, our rabbis wanted us to hear the voices of women. And the rabbis wanted us to see these places in the text where their voices are not just what the men in their lives need to hear, but also what God wants to hear. And knowing that the rabbis who put these stories in front of us today were also operating out of a patriarchal context in which women's stories and voices did not generally drive the narrative and didn't get recorded, it's a very radical move for them to do this. There are many stories they could have put in front of us, and these were the ones that they chose. And I think that they make this radical move because they know that the truth that we so often need to hear comes from voices on the margins. The softer voices, the voices that aren't in the spotlight or the mainstream, who aren't vying for your attention or tweeting at all hours of the day in capital letters. Voices you might not encounter unless you were looking for them or listening for them. Right? And so you saw in our Torah reading, Abraham's got kind of a situation he's created. He's, on the one hand, has a son with his servant, the maid Hagar, an immigrant woman whose name literally means the stranger. Hagar, the stranger. And his wife, Sarah, gives birth to a child. And Sarah expresses discomfort with this new situation in the house, this sort of polyamorous, poly-mishpacha thing happening. And Abraham is distraught by this. And God says to Abraham, Shma b'kolah, listen to her voice, which you should recognize from Shema, which we say twice a day in every prayer service. Shema, listen, Shma b'kolah, listen to her voice. And a few verses later, interestingly, you would think when he puts the water, the canteen on Hagar's shoulder and sends her out, you might think the camera would stay in his house, in Abraham's house, because he and Sarah are, of course, the protagonists of the story. But the camera follows Hagar, the stranger, the immigrant, instead, and Ishmael. And they're lost in the wilderness, in the desert, and she thinks they're going to die, and she calls out. And the text says, Vayishma Adonai et kol hana'ar, in this case. God listened to the voice of the boy. And then, of course, there's Hannah, whose story we just read, which also is a sort of interesting narrative choice for whoever's sort of focusing the camera where it's supposed to go, because the action in the temple, once upon a time in Jerusalem, was not the people who came to pray, it was the priests. The priests making sacrifices on an altar. You can imagine, the altar in the middle with the men in their fancy garb, sacrificing animals and sprinkling blood all over the place to propitiate God for victory in battle or forgiveness or a guilt offering or because it's the new year. And instead, the camera moves ever so slightly to this woman who is muttering in the corner, who's crying, who's pouring her heart out. And we see as Eli, the priest, the sort of authority figure in the room, says, "Lady, what are you doing? Don't do that in here. There must be something wrong with you." And then realizes that she's actually expressing a much needed truth. And he blesses her, and he wishes her the best. And that truth, it's not just that the lottery of who gets to get pregnant and who can't is cruel and unfair. That's a truth that she brings to light. But it's even bigger than that. It's that the religious structure of Judaism wasn't working anymore. It wasn't working. It wasn't designed to serve certain people, basically anybody who wasn't a priest. certainly wasn't designed to serve women. Maybe it did at some point in history, but it wasn't working anymore. And so when one person for whom the system not just wasn't working, but actually had become oppressive, came and spoke up and made her voice heard, she changed the freaking world. And the rabbis in the Talmud spend pages talking about Hannah, how we learn from her, what we learn about how to pray from her, how we're obligated, like she did, to hurl our words at heaven, Heitiach Devarim, Klape Mala, when we have legitimate beef with our life and with the hand we've been dealt. We're not just allowed to do that, that's what God wants from us. That's what changes the world, is when we bring our voice forward in that way. There's so many stories in the Torah that don't do this, that don't share this narrative. The rabbis wanted us to hear these stories of voices that expose the unfairness and hypocrisy in a society that may be working very well for a lot of people, and also still has a lot to do before honoring the voices of everybody in it. It turns out, of course, Hagar isn't the only non-Jew to have borne a child for a Jew or to have been mistreated by a Jew. Hannah wasn't the only woman to be infertile, to be shamed, to have a Jewish authority figure shoot her down in public, and then to bounce back with courage and resilience. And these are the stories we need to hear today. I'm thinking about how last year, at about this time, was when the New York Times ran their piece on Harvey Weinstein. And the singer and actress Ashley Judd said in that piece, you know, women have been talking about this privately for a long time. It's time we talked about it publicly. And then immediately, dozens and dozens of women came forward to speak about similar experiences of harassment, unwanted sexual advances, rape. And within a month, Weinstein's membership from every producer and industry guild had been severed, and the board of his own company fired him. But what's weird about it to me is that it's not like we didn't know. We knew, right? Not just in Hollywood, but everywhere. It's not like before October of last year we didn't know that 1 in 6 women in any room has been a victim of rape or attempted rape. We knew that. And many more subject to harassment of all different kinds at some point in their lives. And it's not like people all over Hollywood didn't know that Harvey Weinstein was like an outright sexual predator. And they made jokes about it on the awards shows and on 30 Rock for years. So how do we understand the overwhelming response, the tidal wave of responses, the public firings and resignations and public shaming, when actually this was a known thing? Everybody knew. And I think the answer is because we knew. Because we knew. And we didn't do anything. For years. People in Hollywood knew for a long time, but the way that you know a deep truth that you don't want to hear, a kol dmama daka, a small, persistent little voice, an inconvenient truth that you insist on not listening to and will do anything not to have to hear. Why? It's sort of a weird thing, right? Why be so hesitant to listen? Isn't it good for us to hear those voices that help shine a light on the ways that our society needs to adapt and change? Isn't that a good thing? Don't we welcome that? Rabbi Nachman, a Hasidic master, says, Ben Adam Olam Katanhu. Each person is a little world. We are all microcosms, and anything that's true about an individual is even more true when you start applying it to how we act as a corporate body. So, all right, let's be honest. How many of us really like it when someone shines a light, someone well-meaning shines a light on something about us that is less than likable? How do we like it? We are resistant to change and embarrassment. So our culture is resistant to change and acknowledging our many shortcomings, right? In this case, it would have meant disrupting business as usual, money lost, projects that people invested a lot of time in, resources thwarted. It would have meant women being even more vulnerable to scrutiny and to doubt. But by not listening for all these years, and then when it can't be avoided anymore, the response can no longer be a sort of incremental shift that might feel plausible and acceptable. It becomes this overwhelming tidal wave that is far more disruptive than had we listened to those pesky, inconvenient voices speaking truth a long time ago. Listening to the voices on the margins is not good for status quo. And you might think, but the truth is, this is what revolution looks like, you know? This is what it looks like when the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's disruptive, when the voices on the margins become part of the center. And then, of course, what happens is when the margins move into the center, new margins emerge. And I think until the Messiah comes, there are always going to be those whose voices are not being heard and whose needs are not being met by the mainstream and who aren't being recognized or honored or given full dignity. And that our rabbis are saying to us today, hey, Jews, be the ones listening for those voices. Not just when you're the oppressed minority, but actually when you're powerful and when you're strong and when you have influence. Then listen to the voices, listen for the voices on the margins, because you've been there, because you know what it's like to be ignored, to be mistreated. You've been there. Listen, listen. Listening for and advocating for these voices is what it means to be a Jew. So I was thinking about this phenomenon. The truth is, it's not just a sort of social collective thing, it's also something that just happens within every single one of us. Think of your own chorus of inner voices competing for attention. The voice telling us we need a career change, or to take our health more seriously, or to get out of the dysfunctional relationship that we're in that's holding everyone back. And you think, but, he makes such good money. But she comes from a great family, but they're Jewish. But we have kids. But I'm too old to do something new. What else could I do with my life? And so we live with this kind of low-grade white noise that we've trained ourselves to turn on every time that little voice speaking an inconvenient truth speaks up. We do something else. We distract ourselves. We check our email, we shop, we eat, we fight, we have promiscuous sex, we surf Facebook, we do anything. But listen, and it's often some kind of tragedy, like a brush with death for ourselves or for a loved one that forces that white noise machine off for just long enough to hear what we need to know and what we need to do. And it might be scary and very uncertain, but what is certain is if you don't listen, you'll never know who you might have become, what life you might have lived. I sent an email out to all of you before the holiday, and I asked, what's a truth that you know? What's a truth that you know that you're not listening to? And what would it take to hear it? Here are some of the things you said. It's not necessary to make 6 figures to be happy. My ex was right to break up with me. We were truly unhappy, but it's time to let it go. Working out, going to the gym is worth it. Yes, it is. The affair I'm having is wrong. You have everything you need. You don't need to shop for more. The desire to shop may speak to an empty place inside. Acquiring more goods is not going to fill it. It never has. at some point there has to be a recognition of enough. Will thinking and writing it make me feel it? I wonder what of these you might relate to, and what might be the inner voice that you know is speaking from within you this year. My good friend suffered with chronic fatigue for years, like debilitating, in bed for weeks and sometimes months, years of seeing specialists, no diagnosis, no cure. And one day she heard a voice inside of her say, "If you stay in your marriage, you will die." The body often acts as a megaphone for that kol d'mama daka, trying desperately to get our attention. And if we're lucky, we hear it before something terrible happens or before we do something really stupid. Now, did she know that leaving a 30-year marriage would cure the fatigue? No, she did not. It was a risk. It was a real risk. But she also knew that if she didn't listen to that voice, she was going to die inside slowly. And so it was worth the risk because she wanted to live. Listening to that kol d'mama daka, that still, small, pesky, inconvenient truth voice, even out of our own consciousness, is risky and can upend the status quo of our lives. And I feel like I need to be clear here and say, not every idea your inner voice has is a good idea. I'll just put that out there. It's not every idea is a good idea. Your voice might be telling you to do something destructive to yourself or someone else. And that's why the instruction, I think, is so powerful. In every verse of the Torah that we've heard, and also when we come to hear the shofar, the instruction isn't to take action immediately. It's to listen. It's to sit with that voice, to listen, to hear it, to breathe it in. Maybe to sit with it for a long time, to just come to understand what's really happening here. We're about to listen to the sound of the shofar, which I'm guessing is the reason why the room is still full. We're about to hear the sound of the shofar, and the specific mitzvah is lishmoa. It is to hear. It's not to play it, although I want to say thank you to all of the people who are blowing shofar. The mitzvah is to hear it, and it's to hear it intentionally. It doesn't count if you just happen to be passing by a place where somebody's blowing a shofar. You have to be directing, inclining your ear, opening yourself to hear it. And the rabbis and the Talmud debate what exactly is the kol shofar, what is the voice of the shofar? Some say it's a battle cry, like in the ancient world, you would blow a horn, like a shofar, to gather the army together. But really, the debate is whether it's moaning or wailing or sobbing, whether it's a woman who is in pain or who has lost her son, who is deeply mourning something priceless and dear. And the specific woman that they describe, we didn't read about her today, but there's a story in the book of Judges about an enemy named Sisera, an enemy of the Jewish people, who was off fighting a war against the Israelites. And the text describes his mother standing in the window, waiting for him to come back, and beginning to fear the worst. And indeed, he has been killed by a Jewish warrior named Yael, who has driven a tent peg through his temple. Maybe you know that story. His mom is standing at the window waiting for him to come back. And the rabbis imagine that the sound of the shofar is her voice, her pain, her cries, when she realizes that her son is never coming home. Just think about what it means for a minute to know that the tradition suggests that when we hear the shofar, the voice that we're hearing is of an enemy's mom. To humanize the people, the specific people we feel most threatened by, whose voices we least want to hear. to remind ourselves that those people have mothers who will mourn for them, who cared for them as babies. What would it mean for us in this time in history when many of us feel actually quite strong and powerful and influential in our lives and collectively as a Jewish people? What would it mean for us to turn our ears and listen specifically to the voices from the margins that we are least sympathetic toward, that we find most threatening? People saying things that offer inconvenient perspectives on reality, that challenge our sense of stability. What would it mean to listen to those voices? Lishmoa kol shofar. Again, there's not an immediate imperative to act, just to hear. Because if we can stand here and bear the dissonance and the resistance internally that we feel, and just listen, and just breathe, and take it in, and allow ourselves to crack open just a little to allow for the possibility for change and transformation, we might just change ourselves in the world.